For the audience that is attending this talk in YouTube, you may write your questions if you want in the chat that is available in YouTube, and we will make our best to address them to Geraint. And I have already a series of questions here. Okay, I'll pick one now from Pam Bernard. You know. The question is, transformational creativity argument and application makes sense. What about transdisciplinary creativity? How does RTE, these three sets of rules, interact in that context?
That's a very good question. Indeed, it has been discussed in some parts of the literature. So if you have multiple disciplines in this context, they would have their separate conceptual spaces. If they are really separate, then there would be no intersection. If they're related, then there would be some intersection. And therefore, it would be possible in principle to, you can imagine a sort of amoeba thing going on where a discipline sort of starts to bud off from another discipline and then eventually separates altogether, maybe just sharing its language, but not the things that are done with that language. And that is, I'm to some degree improvising this answer, and that takes me to Kuhn's philosophy of science, in fact, where you have paradigm shifts, where people become more and more convinced of an idea, and eventually that idea buds off. I don't know if that's the same thing. But in the case of transdisciplinary creativity, what we would have is we'd have multiple R's, we'd have multiple E's, we might even have multiple T's. And the interesting thing then is to consider when you have a creative system which is capable of reasoning at this very transformational level about multiple representations of individual creative systems. And for example, we have colleagues in Helsinki who are working on such ideas. They're very, very difficult to get a handle on, it has to be said. They're very, very difficult. But essentially, the answer to your question is we would be looking at multiple conceptual spaces within a given universe, and then we would be doing a transformational step up, which is that we would be looking at the various systems that can, we would actually be looking at a conceptual space of creative systems. And we'd be choosing the creative systems that could be working within these different domains, and then looking at how they could interact, how they could learn from each other, how they could be combined at that level. I hope that answers your question. It's really answering your question with a much bigger question of how on earth can we do that? And the answer is, we don't yet know.
Thank you, Geraint. I hope you made it. I have a series of very interesting questions here. I'll choose this one now. How wide, broad should the universe of possibilities in the creative systems framework be? Would it be something like a study field, like a psychology, for instance?
So I'm not sure I understood the second word that you said there, Amilcar. I think I had a dropout.
How wide, broad should
I see.
The universe of
wide stroke broad?
be?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Indeed, that's a good question. It depends on what you're doing. Is the bottom line. Now, most of the examples that we have in computational creativity have been relatively small in this sense, relatively narrow, because to do the kind of encoding that would be required to do a really detailed human-like conceptual space is the kind of encoding that we as yet do not have the capability to do in artificial intelligence. It would be extraordinarily rich and varied and probably a little bit self-contradictory, which introduces other problems. So in practical terms, these things tend to be fairly simple. just for practical reasons. In practice, it should be as wide as it needs to be. It needs to have all of the things that we care about as in a given conceptual space. So generally speaking, what we do in these studies, and music is a nice example, the commonest activity that you find in music computational creativity and musical computational creativity is style replication. Why? Well, a number of reasons. Number one is there's lots of information out there about musical style. So if we talk about Bach's musical style, for example, this has been very well studied. It can be read in music theory. And then we can write down rules which are very specific to, let's say, Bach chorales or fugues or something like this. So then we've chosen a small conceptual space, a focused, let's call it, conceptual space, because that makes science possible. We have to do reductionism in science to make it possible, and this is a kind of reductionism, effectively. But in principle, there is no limit, except that if you eventually get a conceptual space which is the universe, then I'm not quite sure what status that creative system has, in that it can never do transformational creativity again, and it always is able to create everything. So that would be God.
Geraint. I forgot to mention that this last question came from Deborah Marques Lago. Now a question from Filippo Carnovallini. Can there be true creativity without teleology? I'd argue not, but I'm not sure if you agree. Well, this is the question and the comment.
Oh, yes.
And what do you have to say about it?
What does true mean? It's a very good point. So can there be true creativity? Well, can there be true intelligence without teleology? It's an interesting question, isn't it? There are people in computational creativity. Christian Guchelsberger, forgive me for mispronouncing his name for a moment there, has done work on motivation for creativity. And this is motivation which is focused entirely, in a games world as it happens, is focused entirely on the basis of information which is gained. So an imaginary organism, an AI agent, which is hungry for information. And Christian has related that to creative behavior. It's a very interesting idea. We know from psychology, from Irving Biederman's work, for example, that humans get a real buzz out of learning. So maybe it is possible that we can motivate these teleologies on a level which is actually non-conscious, which is to do with the effects of what goes on in our brain as a result of learning experiences, as a result of novelty. We like to have our brains tickled by something which is not so novel that we can't understand it, but which is not boring. Yeah? So maybe those things can indeed be non-conscious behaviors, which could then account for a kind of teleology which is emergent from the non-conscious mind into the conscious mind. The more we look at the conscious mind and the non-conscious mind, the more we realize that we're a whole lot less in control of ourselves than we like to think we are at a conscious level. And maybe this is one of those.
Speaking of consciousness, I have a question from Luís Muniz Pereira. How does the consciousness of creative error help guide to a better attempt?
Aha, okay. So just to be absolutely clear there, that kind of consciousness is a slightly different kind of consciousness from what we were talking about earlier. So awareness there, how is the discovery of a creative error appropriate? And that is actually part of, I said there were a couple of things I wasn't going to talk about because I didn't have time, and that is one of them. So in my 2006 paper that I cited, there is introduced the idea of aberration, which is perhaps a slightly strong term for something which is going outside what we expected. So a key contribution of this whole idea is to separate out the idea of something being what you want and being a good thing. Okay, so I gave that example in the jokes. We can recognize that something is a joke, but still not think it's a good joke. But the other side of that is also true. So in the early days of aeronautics, again, to keep on using that example, a plane had to be flapping its wings. And if a plane was not flapping its wings, then it was not in the conceptual space of planes, because that was the idea, that you had to build something that flapped. So you can build an aerofoil, show that it flies, which is the goal. Right? The goal is not to be a plane. The goal is to fly. The goal is not to be the thing we expected. It's to perform a particular function. And so there you could say, well, I have to change my notion of what it is to be a plane. So my conceptual space of planes has changed from being the conceptual space of things that flap their wings, which includes birds, or some birds at least, to the conceptual space of things that have aerofoils attached to them. So this idea of aberration is to say, well, look, a thing can be good in my evaluation, which is here the ability to fly, without being the thing I expected them to be, which in this case is the aeroplanes that flap their wings. And that's one of the values of having these two distinct things, of the notion of what a thing is and then its evaluation. So there are different kinds of aberration, and you can respond to different kinds of aberration in different ways. So if you find something which is outside your conceptual space, but which is no good, then what that means is you are searching the wrong way. So you need to adjust your search to pull you back inside your conceptual space. You were being too wild. On the other hand, if you have aberration and you find something which is good, then generally speaking, you want to adjust your conceptual space to accept that. Yeah? And there are other things there. You can do this with inside the conceptual space. So you can say, well, look, I'm consistently finding things that are not good using this part of the conceptual space. So maybe I want to cut that out and say, well, no, I'm not even going to think of that as the thing I'm interested in anymore. Yeah? So the system then is kind of this flexible thing that can move around according to its own desires. And we can describe that as creativity also at the meta level. So then we can say, well, we can have a creative system which is capable of looking at potential creative systems and being creative by producing new ones from old ones. And there are at least two students who I'm working with at the moment who are working in those ideas, Callum Goddard and Juan Alvarado. So these things are at least feasible. When we want to do this meta level thing, we have to think very carefully about the object level, because you get twice as much complication, which means that the overall complexity kind of squares, and it becomes very, very difficult to see what's going on. So difficult to do for really significantly creative systems at the object level. Right, great question. Thank you for that.
Let me take the last things you have said to refer the following thing. You have mentioned that regarding transformational creativity, you see transformation in the R and in T, in those two sets of rules, but nothing was clear about the evaluation. And my question is, when you find some kind of aberration, you have to evaluate that somehow for yourself, or you must show that to society, to the public, to see what people feel about that. Mm-hmm. Is it a good idea or is it a bad idea? Evaluation here, we see situations in history of people that propose the revolutionary things like new kinds of music that were not successful at all in the first times. Mm-hmm. And were later on accepted and integrated in culture in general. We have situations of that where people are going out the comfortable conceptual space where everybody is playing, goes out, finds something that looks interesting, but it is not acknowledged by the others as a good way of doing things only later on. So there is some kind of adjustment of the E set in these situations, don't you think? Isn't
I absolutely do
this some
think that.
kind of transformation of the E set?
Indeed, I absolutely think that's right. And I think in that sense, you can look at, for example, culture as a creative system in its own right. So it's constantly generating things and judging them and sometimes throwing them out. But the standards by which things are judged are constantly changing. Yeah. So you mentioned music. There are two really nice examples of this. The first is Stravinsky's work, The Rite of Spring, which is now one of the greatest pieces of 20th century music. When it was first performed, there was a riot. Now, part of the riot was probably due to the staging, which was quite revolutionary at the time. There's no doubt about that. But the music also was extraordinarily challenging. And there is possibly an argument that the reason that there was a riot, this was not just that people complained, there was a riot. So perhaps the amount of novelty here was actually affecting people so much that it made them angry, right? So it's like I said, you can have too much novelty, or we like our brains to be tickled, but we don't like them to be really, really challenged. Maybe that's speculation on my part. It can only be speculation. Right, so that's one example. However, now, as I said, even though that was rejected then and caused great trouble, it's now regarded as one of the greatest works of 20th century music. If you don't know it, you should listen to it. The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky, it's amazing. Another example is the work of Arnold Schoenberg, who was more or less contemporaneous with Stravinsky. And he was a great thinker about what he did. He thought about the progression of music through the previous centuries, from something in Mozart's era, which was rather specifically tonal in a very specific way, and which became, that's to say, it used particular combinations of notes in particular ways, and became, as time went on, through people like Wagner to Strauss, Richard Strauss, that is, became more and more chromatic. That's to say, it was using more and more of the notes of the scale all the time, becoming richer and richer in the way that jazz does, for example. And Schoenberg thought to himself, well, why don't I throw away that whole notion that Mozart was fundamentally using there of tonality and having things in keys, and just say, well, everything has to be used an equal amount all the time. And he thought very hard about how to do that. He produced a number of amazing student composers, and his own music is incredible. But it's really, really difficult to listen to. And the reason for that is because humans, when they are exposed to music, very, very quickly learn to use the representation of tonality to help them understand the music. And so what is happening there, I actually referred to this in my talk about learning representations for things. So we find ways to help us understand what we see in the world, and they inform how we feel about it. Now, what Schoenberg actually did was to take that away from his music. So instead of giving most humans something that they could understand in terms of what they already knew, he took away the primary framework that they used for understanding that as a deliberate artistic position. So when you listen to Schoenberg, you have to listen to it in a different way, and to his pupils as well. You have to listen to their music in a very different way from what you normally expect to listen to when you're listening to the earlier composers. So in that sense, Schoenberg's transformation, a deliberate act of transformational creativity, changing what it meant to be music, was, some people would say, not successful. Personally, I think it was amazing. I love his music, but it wasn't successful in the societal way that you were talking about. Okay, sorry, that was a really long answer to quite a short question.
Okay, and you are speaking about evaluation. Now I will take that to include here 3 answers that I would present in a block from Katja Chimel, from Makaran Valankar, and Halia Kim. One of them, the outcome of a creative process is differently evaluated by me, the market community, or the specialists of the field, or even the computer. how can we deal with this? Another question, how can we measure creativity? And another one, how could we quantify value of creative results? I think all this is mostly connected.
Big, difficult questions. They are
Yeah.
all connected indeed. So the
Maybe
first,
you can answer to the block.
Unfortunately, I can't because I don't have answers to all of these questions.
Yeah.
But what I can tell you is some of the things you have to do. So I already talked about the COCO model, where we talk about, when we're analyzing creativity, we talk about the creator, the context. This is not in the right order. Let's try again. The context, the observer, I
think you started with the creator.
Creator, observer, context, and artifact. That's right. Once I got it in the right order, I can remember. Yeah. Creator, observer, context, artifact, which I think in the middle one of those questions, that's saying, yeah, okay, so we have to start by acknowledging that it is subjective and that it's different in all the different ways that you describe. Then perhaps we can start to give some kind of characterization of how it's different, of what is required in each of those different contexts to be successful, to be good. And of course, different things are good in different ways. If we look at music, you know, Britney Spears is good for many people in a very different way from Arnold Schoenberg. She probably makes more money than he did, but that's another story. The point is that these judgments are often very subjective. We do find places where communities of people agree very strongly on things. So, for example, in mathematics, there's a pretty clear idea of what is an elegant proof. It would be very hard to write down what that was, but most mathematicians will be able to say, yeah, that's an elegant proof, or that's not. So depending on exactly what social milieu you're talking about, what group of creative people you're talking about, you may have some agreement there on what is acceptable or not. But the bottom line is, in my opinion, the only way to deal with these problems is to be really specific. You can't give generalities. You have to say, look, here is a case, and you can then say, well, here are the things we need to consider. And that's what the COCO model is for. Here are the things we need to consider in order to be able to do that task. Okay. Then there was the question of, can we measure creative value? Well, I think I just kind of answered that. But there was also the question of, can you measure creativity? And there I would say, no, I don't think you can. I think creativity is a thing that is done. I think it is done more or less successfully. I think maybe different people have more tendencies to do it than others. Maybe some computer systems have more tendencies to do it than others. Yeah? So just measuring creativity, I think you can't do it, because I think that question is not sufficiently deeply, or not sufficiently detailed in order to have a clear answer. Yeah? So I think you have to measure one of these aspects that I've been talking about. And that indeed is why I've been trying to break creativity down a bit into these different aspects, so we can have some hope of actually getting a purchase on it to do something with it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. From Manuel Firmino, a question about human intuition in computational creativity. How can we give a role to human intuition in this kind of setup?
That's a very nice question.
It's something that we can include somehow in the T-set, for instance, or?
Absolutely, it's there in the T-set, and in particular in relation between the traversal rules, which is the T-set, and the knowledge that a creative agent might have about the creative domain. So the intuition in the way I think about things would probably be encoded in the incubation part of Wallace's model. So in other words, it's the process of finding something, and finding something good sooner rather than later. Yeah. So if you think of creativity, I'm not saying it is this, but if you think of it as the process of searching things, then you can imagine a process of searching where you're always starting with something bad and moving towards something good. On the other hand, you can imagine a process of searching where you can kind of jump to a good place straight away because you've got some kinds of clue about where you should start. And that, to me, feels like intuition. It feels like modeling intuition. There's a nice theory of learning due to Karmeloff-Smith, which talks about multiple stages of learning. I'm not going to quote the details now because I can't precisely remember them. But the key idea is that you have to, when you're learning to do a thing, a task, for example, playing the organ, let's say, which is my favorite instrument, you have to think about what your hands are doing when you're a beginner, and your feet too, for that matter, which is one of the things that makes it difficult. So there, you're not using much intuition. One of the things that an organist has to learn as he or she proceeds to being good is to improvise. And so you're learning the skills to play the instrument, which progressively, under Karmeloff-Smith's theory, become more and more encoded into your cognitive system, let's call it. And it comes to a point where you don't need to think about them, and you can just do stuff. So you, as if you're an expert organist, you can see a score and you can pretty much play what's there without really thinking about it. You read the score and your hands do their stuff, and you're not really conscious of the link between them. So that's a kind of intuitive processing as well, yeah? And then to take this into creativity, if you're improvising, when you start off, you have to think, oh, what should I do next? Should I go to that chord? But after a while, it goes, and we say, it goes under your fingers. And you just do it. You think about it. You don't have to think about it. You can just do it. You can get the right stuff. And indeed, if someone comes along and asks you to think about what you're doing, it all breaks. It becomes difficult then to, you know, to actually do it because it's so deeply encoded. So I think intuition is non-conscious. Go on, sorry.
Because it flows. Yeah.
Because yeah. And this is what Csikszentmihalyi calls flow, I guess. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Let me put you one question about exploration. When you make this analogy between the concept of creative exploration and incubation in Wallace's model, it looks like you are considering that exploration is mostly unconscious, an unconscious process.
Up to a point.
Only up to a point, because as far as I'm aware of reports from creative people and my own experience in my small creativity, most of what we do when we are exploring the space of possibilities is hard work and structured work. And it is not a matter of sleeping over the problem and have an illumination the next day. Most of it is hard work, conscious work. So exploration has a great deal of conscious work and conscious processes going around. Don't you agree with that? I'm sure you agree, but please comment on the
it depends on exactly how you're using the model. Yeah. Just one thing, Amilcar was being very modest. He talks about his small creativity. Amilcar is an extraordinarily creative person. I just wanted to say that to clear that up. The exploration can indeed happen in many ways. What I personally am interested in doing is understanding the same thing that Wallace was understanding, which is something that will simulate what a mind is doing in this creative context where there is stuff going on and then suddenly an idea appears. But it is absolutely the case, and I completely agree with you, I probably should have said this in my talk, that it's perfectly possible to take these non-conscious processes and find ways to kind of make them conscious, to find creative methods. And indeed, many artists do this, certainly mathematicians and engineers do it, to find frameworks in which you can be creative reliably. Yeah? Now, those frameworks may not necessarily produce outstandingly creative things in some sense. They may produce prosaic things, but they're there to help you come up with answers when you have to. So a nice example of this comes from music again. So you have the composer, the person who is lucky enough maybe to have a successful career, so they don't have to produce things to order. They can just do it when they feel like it, when they feel it's right. That is a very different thing from the person who is, say, writing music for a TV company and they have to come up with a theme for the program that's going to be on in 2 weeks' time, right? And they've got a deadline. Yeah? So that's a very different kind of creativity, and it's much more likely, I think, to involve the kind of mechanisms that I think you're talking about, right? Where you have, you know, this is how I will lay this out. This is how I will proceed with my task. It is not clear to me that that is the same necessarily as exploratory creativity in the sense that Bowden means. I think Bowden is talking about what goes on in a mind. And I think she, I don't know if she's here, she might be able to correct me. She is, for some reason, everything just moved on my screen. I'm sorry, I got distracted by that. I think Bowden was talking about what goes on in a mind prior to the kind of stuff that you're talking about, which is then sort of externalizing, finding ways to externalize our creativity to make it more directly available on call. There we are.
Okay, let's move to another question. How can, this one comes from Lamberto Coccioli. How can we ensure that in the long term, computational creativity supports human creativity without substituting it? Assuming we agree this wouldn't be a good outcome.
Okay, first of all, I absolutely agree that wouldn't be a good outcome. How can we ensure that? Well, I think that's the same problem that we have with AI in general, right? That we need legislative frameworks which prevent our machines from being dangerous to us. We need things like Asimov's rules of robotics, laws of robotics, which are built in to these machines. As regards creativity, if you're talking about what you might call pure imaginative creativity, then there's probably no harm if a computer imagines something that would be bad for humanity, just so long as it doesn't get to enact it. Yeah? And that could be a useful thing for humanity to know that there is that possibility that maybe humanity hadn't thought of. In terms of a more personal kind of creativity, how do I, as an artist, know that a computer isn't going to come and take my job? Well, for one thing, we know that humans are really biased against computer creativity. They like the fact that computers can create stuff and they find it interesting, but they'll generally judge something by a human as being better in terms of the E set, right? Even if actually the things are swapped around and the thing that they think is a human thing is a computer thing. So we are biased. My personal preference as an answer to that question is that we should not forget that these things are just machines. There isn't a machine condition. We don't have to treat them as equals, but we can treat them as colleagues. We can treat them as a kind of insensitive person who's there to help us, who will do what we tell them to when we tell them to, but who can maybe come up with some useful stuff that we can use. So I really like the idea of co-creativity as a whole. I'm not studying it myself most of the time because it's complicated and really difficult. But as I said, there are people, our colleagues in Helsinki, for example, in Hannu Toivianen's group, who are studying these things. And I recommend you to look at their work if you're interested in that. But the solution to the menace of AI and computational creativity is to keep computers in their place and not let them be more than our colleagues.
Okay, a question from Luis Arandas. Your 2018 theory to model the basic operation of mind is based on Shaman. It may have been published in 2018, but it is previous to that, as far as I remember. But the question is, isn't integrated information theory the opposite? Some neuroscience state-of-the-art research mention other view, e.g. Koch.
I'm not sure about that. I have to say I'm not familiar with that particular reference. But so the stuff about information theory in our work When we first published that stuff, it was pretty revolutionary, actually. And I have to give credit to Darrell Conklin, who came up with those ideas before we did. And Marcus Pierce, of course, who really developed that into a cognitive model of music. Since then, and in parallel, of course, it was happening everywhere. It was a zeitgeist going on. Various people have published different approaches to cognition, and in specifically approaches to the idea that the brain is an information processing organ. Yeah, and this goes right up into theories of consciousness. So we have, for example, of course, the names are going out of my head now as I speak. So Carl Friston and his theory of free energy, which is essentially entropy in a brain, relating information entropy to entropy in the world, and talking about how brains will try to control entropy and so on. And then the other person who's really important in this, I've just lost his name, unfortunately. Amilcar, can you help me here? Jürgen.
I'm not seeing who.
It's right on the tip of my tongue. It'll probably come back later. Okay, so there are various people anyway who've been looking at this context. Yeah. Our information theory work is one of a range of things. I wouldn't want to claim that as being a unique thing. And I'm not able, I'm afraid, to answer your specific question because I'm not familiar with the reference that you're talking about there.
Yeah, no, neither do I. This is not for me. And we are not dialoguing.
I've just remembered Jürgen. So, sorry, Amilcar, just to finish, the person whose name I was trying to remember is Jürgen Schmidhuber, who has a whole theory of creativity related to information. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I didn't think on him.
Okay, I apologize to Jürgen Schmidhuber for not remembering his name at that moment.
Okay. Another question from Luís Muniz Pereira. Wallace's model looks a lot like Hadamard's model. Do you know Hadamard's model?
I don't.
Neither do I. But well, the question is, what is the difference between those models? But I think
I can't answer that question.
So many models of creativity since 100 years ago. You have Wallace, you have Poincaré, Dewey, Guilford.
Absolutely.
Cizmiali, there are so many models
lots
around.
Lots of people.
All of them are models, so they are approximations. So
yeah, indeed. And one of the things I like about the Wallace theory is it's just really simple. It's just these 4 stages. It does this, it does this, it does this. And it fits really nicely in with the other approaches that we've been looking at. So the reason I like to talk about that particular one, because as Amilcar says, there's a whole load of others that I could talk about, is that there's a really good synergy between philosophy and psychology and the AI there. It just in those 3 things that I've talked about today, which I think work very nicely together.
Yeah, okay, thank you. We still have a few more questions. Hello, this is getting lots of questions here. Let me see. Another one from José Raimundo. Speaking of interacting in practical terms, would you regard video games, as instruments or grounds for such a conceptual space for human-machine creativity?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's some really strong work that's been done in creativity in terms of games design, but also in terms of creative behavior of agents in games. So I already mentioned Christian Kuckelberger's work. Cameron Brown did some wonderful work in Simon Colton's group for his PhD, which involved board game design. And at least one of those games is actually certainly was on sale. I don't know if it still is. And it was a revolutionary thing because it changed the shape of the game board. It became, instead of using a square board, I think it used a hexagonal one, if I'm right. Don't know. Anyway, that was what made it new and novel, and people wanted to buy it. So computational creativity in games, it's important. It makes money. and it gives people a lot of pleasure too. So
there is lots of people working on that actually.
Absolutely.
And remember the group of the University of Malta.
Indeed.
Has a strong record on that.
Absolutely.
And so on. There are many people. Another question on a different path. How the use of quantum computers can speed up this process?
I have no idea. I have no idea at all. But I'm pretty sure that I subscribe to the idea that intelligence is probably some kind of quantum phenomenon. And I am both excited and slightly scared by the prospects of quantum computers, therefore. If you want to know more about that, there's a very good person to ask, which is a guy called Bob Cook, who until recently was a professor of quantum physics at the University of Oxford, who now is involved in a company in quantum computing. So his work has a lot to say about these kinds of things, I think.
Yeah.
But I don't know enough about it to speak authoritatively, so I'm not going to say anything.
Yeah. Okay, and a last question regarding the ESET. Who is making this question is Ademar Aguiar. He adds to ESET aesthetics, like being the same thing. Mm-hmm. Did you explore the theory of centers and wholeness of C. Alexander Nature of Order books?
I have not explored that theory. That's an interesting reference. Thank you for that. The reason I have not is because there's plenty else to do, which is quite a lot easier than dealing with the aesthetics question, prior to dealing with the aesthetics question. So my approach has been to try to understand the parts that are relatively straightforward to understand in a computational sense before going into the aesthetics, which involves social, cultural, all of these other kinds of things, psychological effects, and also where the subjectivity becomes really difficult to deal with. So thank you for the reference, that's helpful.
Oh, Asmara is there. Yeah, okay. Well, and I think that we have no more questions now. So maybe it's time to wrap up things and to thank Geraint for this fantastic talk and for having the patience to answer all these questions.
It's been a pleasure. It's been very interesting questions. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Okay. And well, I'm leaving the stage to Manuel Firmin, who is going to close the talk.
Thank you, Professor Amilcar.
And let me finish by thanking again for inviting me to be here today on stage with Geraint again. Maybe we can find personally soon. I hope so.
Yes. I would like to, first of all, thank you very much, Professor Geraint Wiggins, for your fantastic and inspiring talk about this creativity. I thought it was not only about computational creativity, but as creativity also as a whole, consider human issues and so on. So thank you very much. Also, thank you, Professor Amilcar Cardoso, for your moderation on this event. I would like also to thank you all for your participation in this first creativity talk, focus on computational creativity. We look forward to see you very soon, already in our second talk on April 15 with Patty Mize, Professor of Media Arts and Science at MIT, about enhancing human creativity. An excellent night to you all. Please stay safe and be creative. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.